My plan today is to present talk about a series of topics with you that I think are generally relevant to most people. And you will hopefully find at least one idea here of something that you'd either like to try new, do more of what you're currently doing, or kind of spiff up something that you're currently doing. Um, I always do say, because it's true, that every person in this room already has a system for keeping track and doing things, or you wouldn't be sitting in this room. And so I can't presume to know exactly what you might need help with personally, but I'm hoping that there'll be ideas here for something at least for everybody. And I've tried to provide a lot of written resources, books, websites, and some articles that I wrote that are on my website that you can look at later if you like, that will cover a broader array of topics. So does that sound okay? All right. So this is, I love this saying from Bilbo Baggins, because it captures so well the way many of us feel, some of the time at least, if not a lot of the time. I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread. Sometimes I'm asked to give talks about managing multiple priorities. And one day I realized every single person has multiple priorities. It's not a special situation that you find yourself in, given what your job is like. We all have multiple priorities across our life. And so the challenge is how to figure out how to deal with all of those and do things in a way that you would like to be doing them. So this is the agenda that I've selected. Some ideas about making more effective to-do lists, some ideas about managing email more efficiently and effectively being the operative word, some ideas about making time for the most important work that you need to do that often gets drowned out by daily urgencies and interruptions and just routine work, and then some ideas about how to plan your time over the short run. So many of us may have a plan for where we'd like to be like 5 years from now or a year from now, or what we want to get done this month or this quarter. But all those do is represent plans that sit around unfulfilled if we don't figure out how to get the actual work done this week and in a day. So we're going to talk a little bit about weekly planning and daily planning. So does that sound okay? Anybody who's not interested in any of those topics can leave now, although you read the objectives, right? So hopefully you did it before you came. So let's start. Let's start with keeping track of your work. And of course, this you would be easily able to figure out. This is talking about where you're going to record stuff that you need to do, and the standard methods would be on some kind of a list, or on a calendar, or typically both. Most people have a hybrid system where some things go on their calendar and some things go on lists. Is there anybody here who doesn't use any kind of, everybody has to use a calendar. You're forced by your institution to do that. Does anybody here who doesn't use lists outside of a calendar? Okay. Good, you all get gold medals. No, it's actually not true. You can do it either way, but I was just curious about that. The underlying reason why we need to do this is pretty obvious. Most of us have too many things to do to try to remember them all. And so the obvious reason why you should record them is because otherwise you'll forget. Do we agree that that's the primary reason that you want to write things down? But there's another reason that has to do, now I said I was going to not say anything about any cognitive science stuff today because we have at least one neurologist in the room. Are there others? So I have to be a little, here we go. This is the gynecologist's interpretation of cognitive science. So I'm free to say whatever I want. So it turns out that there's evidence that's been around for over a century, and in modern times, some modern research to support the idea that when you have something in your brain that you need to do and haven't done it yet, if it stays in there long enough undone, you start to have stress around that. So Bluma Zygarnik, a young Russian psychologist in the early 19th century, with her colleagues, actually did the original experiments, as I understand it, around this, and other people have studied it since. So you also want to record everything that needs to be done, not just so you'll remember it, but so your brain doesn't have to hold on to it, which leaves you in a position to be more focused on what you're actually doing. So it's a stress reliever in that way. And another reason to make sure that you record everything that you need to do that you can't do right away, of course, if you can do it right away, that's fine, is because the only way you can really effectively prioritize and plan is if you're looking at all the possible options in front of you outside of your brain. Your brain can only hold a few things in active memory, and trying to prioritize like 15 things, you just can't do it. It's not really possible. So by writing them down, you can do an effective job of prioritizing. So there are lots of different reasons why it's a good idea to not just have a list system, but a complete list system where everything that you need to do gets written down. So that's my first suggestion to you. And there's a case report about this that will just drive this home really easily. So here is how the brain works of someone, not you. You understand, not your brain, but someone who is trying to remember everything or most things. Their brain is filled up with these little memorized tasks, and there's no room left over for thinking. Now, I know I have those little T's in the wrong part of the brain, but that's just, at the time what I did. It was a graphic artist decision rather than a... Now, there's another brain that we can look at. This is the case report. Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein is reputed to have said many times that he never tried to remember anything. He didn't know his own phone number. He said, if I want to call myself, I'll look it up in the phone book, just like everybody else. And so Einstein's brain was filled with actual thinking and creative work and so forth, and not focused on holding on to tasks. So there you go. You can't argue with that. So let's talk a little bit about lists and some things you might think of doing if you're not already doing them to make them more effective. I have to show you my frog and toad picture. So how many people know the Frog and Toad children's series? This is just a wonderful little series written back in the, 40s or 50s. It's pretty old. And this story was about Toad and what happened to him when his list blew away. It was a bad day for Toad. It was a bad day for Toad. And it's a bad day for me if I can't access my lists to figure out what I'm supposed to do. So that was just a little intro at one time, but then I realized one day that this is actually, this is actually the very first example in history of a list stored in the cloud. All right, now there are two key features of an effective list system. The first one I've already suggested to you is that you have to write things down. Now, when I say write down, you can dictate them, you can type them, you can do whatever you want just to get them into someplace out of your head. That's the first thing. Get it all down, get it all down, get it all down. The second, but that's not enough, of course. The second key thing is you have to look at the lists regularly. I'm looking at everyone here. Because one of the main complaints that people tell me about in sessions like this about why their lists don't work for them is because they don't look at them. So the solution is to look at them. This is like if you're hitting your toe and it hurts, stop hitting your toe with the hammer. So looking at it regularly turns out not to be so easy because when you're busy, the thought of looking at your lists is kind of hard to do. So in the planning section, we're going to talk about a routine that you could get into that will help you to stay on track with actually looking at your lists. Now, another suggestion would be, if you're not already doing this, is to keep what I'm calling here a master list. It does not have to look like this one. This is just a sample done on a legal pad. A lot of people make lists that are time frame anchored lists. So they make a list for the day, or their list is for the week, or they make a list for the month. And these lists all have to, especially the monthly ones, have to be sort of rewritten or completely redone at the end of the month. What I'm suggesting here is that you have one list, one place where everything that you think of that you intend to do goes as a master database of all the possible things you could be choosing from. And then you take that and turn that into a shorter term list for a few weeks or however you'd like to do, whatever time frame you want. And then that's where you can, and from that you can come up with a weekly list and then a daily list so that you keep everything. There's nothing that you're trying to remember. And then make your shorter term lists using this as a database. Does anybody here do this? And do you find that helpful? Both of you are eating. That's kind of rude of me to ask you to. Can you talk anyway? Yeah, okay. Oh. I'll
found this new app I really like, and it just has one of the categories of tasks, and I just like
throw them all in there. What's the app?
To actually, UVA pays for it.
So it's the Microsoft program. That's right. So Microsoft, yeah, makes an app now that was eventually going to be completely integrated into Outlook. So the idea she has is she has this app where she just throws the tasks into the thing called the task list. And then you can also make other lists in that program. There are lots of third-party apps that will do that. So that's one way to have it with you at all times. Great idea. Anybody else want to say anything about their master list or how it's helpful? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I have a master to-do list, but it's usually somewhere where I can't
There we go.
stay with me.
So the problem with her list is that she can't access it everywhere. And so that's another key improvement that you can make if your list is in a place where you can't access it, is to somehow convert it into a form that you can have with you. So there are lots of different ways to do that. If it's a document, you could take a picture of it. If you really don't want to go away from paper and the paper is someplace where you can't do it, you could go to an app that synchronizes. You could go to something that's bound or a notebook that you always carry with you at all times. So there are lots of different options for making your list accessible key element. Yes?
I was going to say, you have all of these apps on phone and computer and all sorts of versions of things.
That's right. So a lot of the apps that are available, including the new Microsoft To Do app, which is actually the old Wunderlist app, which has been around for a really long time. And Microsoft bought up the entire operation. So the people that developed Wunderlist are now working for Microsoft, continuing to work on that product. So it's the same product with some modifications. That synchronizes across any device. The reminders program on the iPhone will synchronize to the task list in Microsoft. I don't think there's a web version of reminders, so that's a little limited, but at least it's on your phone, which you have with you most of the time. Workflow, there are dozens of apps, and Workflow is one of them. I think I have a slide here that has some suggestions, but has a link you can go to if you're interested in trying an app to look at what the current ones are that have been around for a while and are solid. So that's the master list idea. It's the way to become completely stress-free around not worrying about forgetting things. The second idea is something that actually turns out to be harder to do than it sounds, and that is to have a single calendar in your life that has all of your time commitments on it. Now, the reason this becomes complicated is some of you at work may have multiple, I don't know, does that happen here with multiple calendars that you can't necessarily synchronize? Or you have family calendars that you need to take into account. So I'm just going to stop right there and say there's no simple solution to this. In the worst case scenario, you'd have to go with a paper calendar and write things down. But ideally, you'll find one of your calendars that you can maybe synchronize on your phone. That turns out to be the simplest way. If it's a Google Calendar, like I right now have a Google Calendar, and I have 2 Microsoft calendars, and I can see them all on my phone and overlap them. So that may be your solution. So here I'm just setting out a goal for you, which is to figure out how to have a place where all your time commitments are located so that you don't overschedule, double schedule, have things back to back that can't work out that way. Everybody gets the idea about why that's a good idea. Now, there's another kind of stuff that comes into our head that looks like work but really isn't. And those are ideas that you have about things you might want to do at some later time. You're not committed to them, or you are, but you're not going to be doing them for quite a while. If you put those kinds of ideas on your regular to-do list that you're working off of, it dilutes the list and confuses your brain. Why are we looking at all these things that we're not actually working on? So the better practice is to pull all those items out and put them someplace else for safekeeping. So you accomplish your purpose of not carrying around ideas in your head, but your to-do lists are actually confined to things that you're actually going to do, at least as you're thinking about it right now. So this demonstrates conceptually how you would do that. You'd have your one place where, however your list system looks like, whatever you do. And then you have some place where you keep ideas, what I'm just going to call ideas for later. Does anybody here follow the David Allen Getting Things Done program? This would be the someday maybe list. If that wasn't obvious to you, it probably was. There are a couple different ways that you can, places where you could think about doing this, which must not have ended up on that slide. So the first place would just be a list, or a folder, or a shoebox, or a set of Post-it notes all stuck together in one place. Any place where you can just download these ideas and keep them for safekeeping. Doesn't really matter how you do that. The other idea is that if this is something that you'd like to bring back into your life at a particular time in the future, you can just make a note on your calendar. So say, for example, UVA promised all of its employees an expense-free trip to Maui a year and a half from now. You're going to flood the island. Everybody's going to be there. But you don't know if you can go because your cousin's son may get married that week. So you can't really make a commitment right now to going on that trip. So what should you do? Well, you should figure out, when do I have to commit to the Maui trip? And how, and at that point, put it on the calendar and then confirm with your sister, your cousin there either is or isn't going to be a wedding. And if they don't know, you're golden because you've already committed to something if they haven't. So you just make a note, and or it's let's say a grant, what could it be? A grant that you'd like to submit to an agency or a foundation that doesn't have a time limit right now. You know they take that kind of work, and you'd like to think about a grant. So you can't do it right now. Just throw it on your calendar when you think the first time is you'd like to pull that back into your life. Does that make sense? So you can use it both for personal and professional. Does anybody here do an ideas for later kind of setup? And do you find that helpful? You do, yeah. So see, we have at least three spontaneous testimonials for this idea also. So, anybody questions about how that works? Now, at some point, when I'm talking about all these different things, sometimes people's eyes start to glaze over because I'm having a hard enough time with just one list. That's okay. Don't worry about it. If you want to just have a simple, flat list to start with, to get used to the idea of writing everything down, just do that. And then as you get used to that, you'll begin to see ways that you could break it out into different places if it would be more useful to do that. But just start with a plain, flat list and write everything down. That's how I got started 20 years ago. I had a legal pad. It was not pre-computer in those days, but it was, not, there weren't really apps. So I just had a legal pad. Every time something came up that I had to do, I wrote it down on the legal pad. I crossed things out when I finished them. When I got to the bottom of a page and thought of more things, I just go to the next page and keep writing. If a page got mostly crossed off, I'd tear it off and rewrite the undone things at the end of the list. I did that for a couple of years, and it honestly changed my life. I was not stressed anymore about things, and there it all was. Now, as my work got more complex and I started learning more, I developed a slightly different system that is maybe a bit more, allows planning a little bit better. But that flat list can work really well for a lot of people. Now, there's another reason that lists can cause problems, and that is there are things on them that you just seem to never do. Has anybody ever noticed that? That the items just sit there like lumps, and you're not doing them. So there are lots of different reasons probably why that happens, but here are two of them. So the first one is that the item on the list is too vague. It says, you've written down bus ticket. What would we do with that item? Those of us who are looking at this list. What do you suppose that means? Does it mean buy a bus ticket? Cancel a bus ticket? We don't really know. Now, you might say, well, who cares? If I wrote that on my list, I would probably know. And that's true when you first write it down. But then, as time passes, you may actually forget completely what that was about. And then you'll have to stop and think, what was this about a bus ticket? And then you'll remember. So you've now wasted a lot of time. Another example would be call Mary. So when you wrote it down, you knew what you were going to do. The next week, you remembered you remember who Mary is, but you can't remember why you were calling her. And then 6 weeks later, you can't remember which Mary it is. So putting a more detail into the item will always make your life easier. And here's an example of the bus ticket. So this is the way I would write this article, this task. Buy a Trailways bus ticket online for Jane, my daughter. I know that it's my daughter. For Thanksgiving, trip home from college, November 20th to the 25th. So almost all of my task items look something like this. I might abbreviate some words, but I write them out in a fair amount of detail. So does anybody here do that? And does anybody think, I would be writing all day long if I had to write down this much detail? I mean, does that occur to you that this seems like maybe excessive? So here are the reasons why it's not excessive, and it actually doesn't take that long. The only time it takes a long time is if, in fact, you don't know exactly what you're going to do. So sometimes you'll write down something kind of cryptic, like buy a Trailways bus ticket, which you've never done before, and you actually don't know how to buy the tickets, and you haven't talked to your daughter yet about when she's coming home. So when you write down bus ticket or buy bus ticket, even if you know what the end product is, if you haven't figured out how you're going to do it, you're going to avoid that item, potentially, because it's kind of vague and you haven't ever done it before. So by forcing yourself to put down enough information in the item that you can execute it off of the item itself and not have to go elsewhere for information, the more likely you are to do the thing in a timely way. That, for me, works almost every time. This is a major anti-procrastination tool that I've been using for a long time. So I discover things I don't really know how to do, and then I know the next thing I have to do is figure out how to do them. So that's what goes on my list. And when I look at an item, I can just do it. I don't have to rethink it or look stuff up. So think about converting your items into more detail. One clever person accurately described this method as delegating tasks to your future self. And if you were doing that, right, you would always give this much information. And so unless you're going to do it tomorrow, even then it's better just to get it out of your system. Sometimes when I write these, I think, oh my goodness, I could do that right now, and then off I go. Sometimes it just leads to very quickly doing them. Now, the other problem, and maybe a bigger one for a lot of people, is that they just write down the code word: grant, book, plan party. One guy that I worked in a small group I had at the Iowa campus, it said promotion. And I said, well, let's talk about that one. So what kind of a task is this? He said, well, I think I'm supposed to be promoted this year, but other than that, I don't really know. So how long, how long was he going to look at this before figuring out that in fact, this isn't a task at all? These are outcomes of a series of tasks. Outcomes of a series of tasks. So it's some kind of deliverable that you're trying to produce. You're trying to get ready for promotion, you're trying to plan a party, you're trying to plan a trip, you're trying to write a grant, you're trying to buy a new refrigerator. It could be anything that's kind of a big outcome that has a lot of things, steps or actions or tasks that you're going to need to do. So on your task list, what you would want to do is for that project is to write down an actual task, something that's doable in a given time frame. Draft the aim for K, or even better, schedule 30 minutes, spend 30 minutes drafting aim 1. That would even be better because it would be time limited and you could visualize what it is you're going to be working on. Now, some people, their work really depends almost exclusively on projects. And so their task list may not have the projects listed on it, but it'll just have the tasks, but they keep track of their projects in their head. And when you say, well, tell me about all your projects, show me your list. Well, they don't have a list. I would say this happens 75% of the time when I ask faculty about their project work. And I bet for those of you who aren't faculty, the same thing is probably true, maybe for home stuff or other things you're doing in your job at work. So the idea here would be to keep a separate list of projects, because these represent the big pieces that you're trying to get done that often are the most important things that you'll be doing in terms of advancing your career or providing value to the institution or elsewhere, patients or science. But you don't keep track of them in a very careful way, and that's one of the reasons why they don't get done. So this would be just a conceptual view of what the relationship between the projects and an actual to-do list. So you keep your list of projects. These, of course, are sort of faculty-like projects, but you can think of anything that would apply to you. So you just have a list of those. And that can be more complex, but just a simple list, actually, is a good way to start. And then when you think of what's the next thing I'm going to do for that first project, you put it on your task list. What's the next thing I'm going to do here? I put it on my task list. And then it has all your other standalone tasks. Call the dentist to get your teeth cleaned, blah, 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 whatever the usual things that are on your to-do list. Does this concept make sense? Now, there are different ways to organize this, so we're not going to, this talk isn't about to-do lists, although you're kind of fearful that it may be. So this system that I use is based on, is David Allen's Getting Things Done system. There's a nice book that you can read about it, or go on the web and read about the essentials of it if you're interested in this. But there are many other ways. There are other systems to keep track of these two kinds of things, because they represent, the tasks represent actual action, things you're going to do, and the projects represent outcomes you're trying to achieve that need to be prioritized and planned for. So they're different types of things. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So for something like write and submit the K, or for a project like write and submit the K application for next funding cycle, do you recommend making like an exhaustive list of everything that it would take to get that done, or put on like a few things and kind of go sequentially?
That is a really great question. People often misinterpret this method as requiring that you think of every single little thing you need to do. That is completely wrong. So you should think of, for a big project, like the pieces of it. Like I've got to get my collaborators straightened out, I need a budget, you know, the usual list of steps or milestones or pieces when put together that lead to the project. But that's all you have to do at the beginning. And then your only job then is to think, which of these do I want to work on first, and what's the next thing I have to do for that, period. So you only need one to make this system work. And then when you're done with that, what do you think you do for a project? I did the first one, what do I do now? What's that? Well, you make a new thing. No, you figure out, now that I've done this, what do I do next? So you sequentially think of tasks as you need to, at the task level. Yeah, it's a really good question. Anything else? So you can, if you don't interested in doing this method, the idea that we're talking about of keeping a project list that might be separate from your task list so that you keep an eye on these bigger things. A lot of you do it in some way, like maybe something on a whiteboard, or you know the things you have to do. So if you're not doing that, think about whether that would be helpful to you. Okay, we're finally done with lists. So I'll breathe a sigh of relief. I will say, though, that having an effective place to write things down, for me, was the thing that really allowed me to have the mental space to be able to do other things, because I wasn't so busy worrying about what I had to do. It reduced my overwhelmed feeling pretty dramatically. And now I could go on and do other things. So now we're going to talk about email. Is there anybody here who doesn't really have any issues with email and would like to be excused for a few minutes? I mean, I'm not saying there isn't anybody like that, but this is really, if you look at the sort of business literature now, this is like the bane of everybody's existence. It's not just in academic medical centers. This is everywhere. There was a recent study that I saw just a snippet about, saying that in some business they had actually had some way of actually counting how many times people looked at their email during the day. What do you think the average number of times the workers in that business, big business, looked at their email? 84. 84 times. Can we all agree that's not a good thing? It completely, when you're looking at your email that often, you are clearly distracting yourself. You're being distracted from things that you should be focusing on instead. So it's a major cause of distraction and loss of focus. Okay, so the concepts we're going to talk about here apply to any kind of routine work that you have that comes regularly. And some of you may have certain kinds of paperwork, either actual paper or workflow type things that you're responsible for keeping up. You may have other kinds of like discharge summary. There are all kinds of things that people do routinely in their job that follow this same dynamic. Now, when I was in ninth grade, I had to take a course, a required one-semester course, in which we looked at different kinds of career opportunities and took interest inventories. I don't know if they still do that in school or not. And so in the G section, I found a couple of things that looked interesting to me. One was graphic artist, and the other was gynecologist. And when I show you this slide, you'll understand that gynecologist was a much better choice for me. So I spent a lot of time, by the way, making these little circles and then grouping them and copying them. It's a very expert job at creating the day. So I spared you the playing it out day by day and just show you what happens after 4 days. Think about it for a minute. If your email comes in and you don't look at any of it, do anything with what comes in today, what happens to it the next day? Does it go? Has it gone away? Like vanishing ink? No. It's Snapchat. That would be a great idea. A Snapchat-like email. If you don't get to it in 10 hours, it just disappears. I never thought about that. So no, of course, it just adds in. And so nobody really does this. Is anybody here ever, consistently? No, you don't day after day not do any email. But what would happen if you did all but one email? What would your email inbox look like after a year? It would have hundreds and hundreds of messages in it, wouldn't it? Well, it would at least have 365 messages in it. And so it doesn't take missing very many per day to add up over a fairly short period of time to a big backlog of things that you haven't really dealt with. So this is not a good deal, and it leaves you after a while feeling like a lot of people do, just kind of overwhelmed in email or whatever that task is that you have that's like email. Maybe the electronic medical record may share some characteristics of this phenomena. So the only solution that I would be able to think of if I was just looking at this, well, what would the only solution be? What would the solutions be? You could, what's that? You could just, yeah, you could be your own Snapchat and just delete everything periodically. You could do that. Not suggesting that. If you had someone to delegate to, there are some people who do have someone they could delegate most of their email to, but that's not most of the people in this room, right? You don't have that assistant who can is just for you and can help you with your email. So people in positions that have those assistants actually do use them, but you don't. Most of you don't have that option. So the only option really is to look at them and figure out what you're going to do and do it. So let's talk about a method to do that. This method I'm going to talk to you about, Inbox Zero, incorporates some important standard strategies for routine work. And the first one is, that may not seem obvious to you at first, is the avoidance of trying to do two tasks simultaneously. It's, of course, by now everyone recognizes that you can't truly do anything simultaneously. You're always rapidly flipping back and forth in milliseconds between two, so texting and driving, so when you're trying to simultaneously do two things, it is not possible, and it erodes your performance on each task in the studies that have been done with PET scanning and functional MRI and exciting things like that by 50% at least. So your performance degrades. So here's my recommendation. When you're doing email, do email. If you're doing email, focus on the email as if it's actually part of your job, which it is. It's actual work. Focus on it. Now, this means that, now maybe you've never heard of this practice of when you're on a conference call. I caught some of you there. Doing your email while you're participating in a conference call. Now, if it's a conference call you don't have to participate in and you're just being forced to do it, even though you don't need to be on it, you want to ignore it, that's fine. But otherwise, you'll find yourself in a situation that's happened to me many times. I'm going along, and suddenly I'll hear, Susan, Susan. What do you think about that? This happens on my Swan, because we're dispersed, so all of our meetings are by conference call. And I'll say, oh, I had to step out for a minute. Could you repeat the question? Lying, I have to lie to get out of it. So you know what I mean. So when you do that in a meeting or on a conference call, or I actually did see at breakfast the other day in an airport, these 4 guys sitting at a table. 3 of them were on their computers typing, and the other guy was just talking to them. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. They all looked down like this, and he was just chatting about his life and personal things. When you're doing your email, treat it like work. Get focused on it. It will go much faster if you do that, and you won't make as many mistakes like sending things to the wrong person or saying things that you regret later and so forth. Treat email like work. Okay. The second is when it's possible, don't do, and you know this already, don't do emails as they pop up during the day. Do them in batches. Now, some people have a job where they have to see them as they come in. And so if that's your job, don't follow this rule. But those of you for whom monitoring email on a constant basis is not part of your job, let's not have it not monitor it. Turn the notifications off so that you don't know that new emails have come in, and then figure out how much time has to elapse before you feel as if you have to look at your email to see what's come in. So what I mean by that is some people worry that, or know that they get a lot of urgent requests from a boss or a colleague, and if they don't check every 45 minutes, they're going to be in trouble. If that's true for you and there's no way to change it, then you just have to do that. But don't think of the email leading up to that 45-minute mark. Obviously, 45 minutes is not ideal. I'd rather have it be at least 2 hours. Some people can get by with 2 or 3 times a day. Try to make it the batches be as far apart as you can possibly make them. Does that make sense? Do most people do their email that way? How many people do it as it comes in? Not because they have to, just because they are completely addicted to it and can't. I know what you mean. It's very addictive. All right. So see if you can create some batches. Even if you do some of your stuff when it pops up, if you could move most of your email work to a batch. It's one of the things about doing it in a batch is you minimize context switching, which is when you're doing one thing and then you go to another thing. There's a mental switch that you have to take. So in an email, you're typically in the same sort of mental frame. And so there's less context switching, and it'll go faster than if you're jumping around between dissimilar kinds of tasks. Now, all of us it would be helpful for us to think about in our job, are there certain kinds of things that we do regularly that are kind of processes? And it would be better if we would write down the process instead of trying to remember it every time, especially if it's something you don't do very often. This idea of making checklists or process lists is in the popular culture now, ever since that book by, is it Atul Gawande, wrote a book that got a lot of play a few years ago where he talked about using them in medicine. So just as a general thing to do, look at your job and see if there are things that you do where you're always wondering when you sit down to do it, now how did I do that last time? Make a checklist if you did. So that's the general rule. The other thing, though, is about using standard processes to do things. So when you do something that you do regularly, try to come up with a process that is as efficient as possible, and then stick with that. Don't wing it every time and do it a different way. And it'll be easier for you if you at least initially write those down so that you you learn them and they become habitual. Now, the way in which this applies to email is I'm going to suggest that you have a standard process for processing email, rather than just diving in and doing whatever you like. I'm going to show you my process so you'll get a sense of what that looks like. And then the final one is the 2-minute rule, which is, this is David Allen's expression of the standard advice from time management experts, that if something could be done right away, just go ahead and do it. Don't bother to write it down and put it off if you can do it right away. And you're not in the middle of something else. Just get it done. Allen has condensed this into into putting kind of a 2-minute limit on that. That's just, it's not a metaphor, but that's just a guideline. Now the way this, and you can apply this across all of your work. Some of you do it naturally, and others of you, like me, it took me a while to learn how to do this. Where it applies to email is that there are a lot of emails that come into you during the day that you could in fact take care of very quickly if you just took the time to do it. Where we get caught up sometimes in email is we think, well, this isn't all that important. I could do this later, even though it's a quick response. And of course, the problem is that if you have a whole bunch of those little things piling up, that's when you get into that overwhelm with all the things you've not done. So the better idea is if you have the time, go ahead and just respond to as many things as possible right on the spot. So now okay. Okay, so now what we're gonna, boy, this is a wild slide changer. I think I won't touch it here. So the method I'm going to describe to you is called inbox zero. Some people call it zero inbox. It's been around for a while, more than 10 years, 15 years probably. If you follow this method exactly the way it was is described originally, at the end of the day you have an empty inbox. And here's what that looks like. An inbox with no. Now, you don't have to use that as your metric. There are people who prefer to keep all their messages in their inbox after they've finished with them, believing, even though it's not really true, that it'll be easier to find them later. Since search works everywhere, it isn't really true. But some people just have done that and it works fine for them. They don't put anything off. I say go for it if that's what you do. But for me and most of us, it feels cluttery to look at an inbox that has a lot of stuff in it. And you have to be just religious about making sure everything that's there has been taken care of, except for the unread stuff. And that I could never do that. So this method takes care of that latter problem. There are 3 ways you could get to this. We've already talked about the deleting everything at the end of the day. And I think we've all agreed that we're not going to do that. Right? I don't want to be responsible for anyone losing their jobs, so please promise me you won't do that. The second way we could do it is to have a series of folders related to projects and people. And when an email comes in about that project or with that person's name on it, we just move the email over to the folder and say to ourselves, I'll get back to that later. That's not what this means either. That's the one you can't do. So the method is really a simple one conceptually. It would be like if you took a big stack of paper mail. You would just grab the first one off the top, open it up, junk mail, throw it away. Next one, ooh, I got to put that in my file. It's about taxes. This one is a letter I need to reply to, but I don't have time right now. I'm going to put it here, and all the things that I have to do later are here. And here are some things that I could do right away. I'll do them right away. That's all it is. You just look at every single email to the extent that you need to figure out what you need to do, and then do it if you can. And if you don't have time to do the thing that needs to be done, you segregate it out in its own spot, a place for undone, unreplied to messages. That's all the method is. It's really not very hard. There's a lot of anti-inbox zero sentiment out there, though. There are articles in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and all these bloggers who say you should never try to do this. It's just unrealistic. I honestly don't know what they're talking about. Do they mean that like 2/3 of your messages, you just shouldn't even look at them? You should just let them sit there? I think there's a misunderstanding about the following point. I think a lot of people interpret this method to mean every email has to be completely managed and finished and dealt with on that day while you're doing it, that there's no deferring things. And that's completely wrong. Of course, if you had to do everything at the spot, you get an invitation to write a chapter. Well, I better do that right now because otherwise I won't have an inbox zero at the end of the day. No, of course not. So I think if you understand that that's not the purpose here, the real purpose is to be sure that you've seen everything and made a decision about what you need to do, so there are no surprises in there, and do the ones that you can right on the spot, because a lot of it is quick. Does that make it sound more like something a method to think about? Maybe, I guess, yes?
How do you decide, how do you keep track of what you've done and what you haven't?
Oh, so how to decide? Can you hold that question? I'll give you some options. There are actually several different ways that you can do it. So I'll show you a slide that's got, and these slides you'll get. You all get these slides, so you'll have that on it. That's a really important question. But let's go through the method first, and then we'll come to that. Okay, so you know what? I'm going to just move on from that, because that's. Let's go ahead and talk about what to do if you have hundreds of messages in your email. Okay, does anybody here have more than 86,000 messages in their inbox? So no one has set a record in my personal experience. 86,000 was the most recent number I heard, and I thought, well, you're all in good shape, don't you think? So if you want to try this method and feel as if you have so many messages in your inbox that it would you wouldn't be able to experience the joys of an empty inbox very quickly. You can do that. You can do it by doing a quick start method where you create a new folder called something like inbox messages before whatever today's date, or maybe yesterday's date. And then you move your entire inbox in there. Then you take out today or maybe a couple days worth and move them back here. And then your plan from now on is to finish up today and to pop back in here when you have time to go in backwards order from the most recent to the last in reverse chronological order to find things that you still need to deal with. Do you have to go through all 86,000? No. Do you have to go through all 700? No. Because most of those are dead as a doornail by now. The half-life of an email is very short. And anything that came 3 weeks ago, the odds are good it's too late. Or if it's not an important, someone will send you a reminder. So you do not have to go through all the messages, but you should keep them. I just tell people to hang on to this, folder. You know what, the laser button is in the place where that's why I keep doing that. I want you to know it's not a sign of mild cognitive impairment. It's a device I haven't used before. Okay, so this is just, you can do this if you want to. You don't have to. It's just a way to get going quickly. Okay, so here is the process I use every single time I look at my email. First of all, I don't look at my email unless I'm prepared to do something productive with it. If I have to look on my email at odd times, on my phone rather, I at least delete everything that can be deleted without opening it up. And anything that looks really urgent, I might open it and then deal with it if it is. Otherwise, I ignore everything else, because the phone is not really the best place to do this. You can do a lot these days because you can have folders, but my preference is to do my email on a larger device. So you have to decide whether that's practical for you or not. And you can do this whole thing pretty much on a phone if that's your only real choice. But don't look into, so no more checking randomly. Look for a purpose. Okay, so I do 2 passes. So the first pass is I go through every message in the inbox. Remember, this is just from yesterday or 2 hours ago, so it's not like tonight, 2014 or anything like that. I go through and I delete everything I can delete without opening the message. So it's based on what's on the subject line, sender or title. Just delete. On the second pass is my workaround. By the way, you can do an urgency scan when you're doing that also. If something pops out at you as being urgent, you can look at it. On the second pass, I start personally with the newest one. One, because I'm confident I'll get to the bottom, at least by the end of the day, because I've been doing this a long time and the numbers aren't so huge. But so you could start with the oldest one and work up. Otherwise, you may end up with this stagnant pool at the bottom that you never quite get to. And here's how I do it. I open the top message, and I deal with it. I read it as much as I need to read, figure out what I need to do it if I can, set it aside if I can't, and then I move right to the next one. I do not stop and say which email would be the best one for me to look at. You waste enormous amounts of time reading and rereading your email titles when you could just be working. So once I switched over to not skipping and just doing them like an assembly line, wow, it made it go faster. I felt a better sense of progress. I wasn't setting things aside that I was trying to avoid, which just added to my stress in the moment. And so that's my standard way to do it. Now, sometimes you're in a big hurry. You're going off to do a liver transplant. You won't be available for several hours. And you have to pick out the ones that really seem like they're urgent. But for the most part, I'd like you to think about trying this method of no skipping. Now, the algorithm for what you ask yourself about each one is pretty simple. The first question is, should this just be deleted? Now, in the new version of Microsoft, which I think I've determined you all have, there's a new feature called the archive folder. There's a ribbon, in the ribbon on the email page, there's a little, on the far left side, there's a little icon that looks like a banker's box. And I think it says archive underneath it. And then if you look in the list of folders in the inbox, there'll be a folder that says archive. This is not archiving. It's not archiving. Why they call it archive, I don't know, because it's just confusing. It's just a folder. It's just a folder into which if you touch the email and press the button, it'll go in there. Or you can just drag the message over to the archive. It's just a folder to put messages that you want to save or don't want to delete without putting them in some kind of specific topical folder. The evidence around folderizing is that you should minimize how often you do that, because it's the fastest way in the research that's been done to find an email, retrieve an email, is through search. Now, I don't believe that that's always true. So there are some specific things that like if I have a project, I make a folder for it. All the email about that project goes in there. I think it's quicker for me to find things if I can go right to the project folder. But I only do it about active work now. I don't do it about other kinds of things. I just archive them. So you'll have to experiment a little bit with that and learn how to use the search function maybe better than you do right now. So delete or archive is the first option. And then there are some that need to be filed either in archive or in a special folder that you keep. Do it right then. So what I find with people who are learning this method, the one thing that they consistently don't do at the beginning is delete, archive, or file. They just let them sit there. And they say to me, it would take me too long to do that. And I say, it would not take you too long to do that, so please delete, file, and archive. Because if it's really taking too long to file, it means your folder system is way too complicated, right? So try to do that at the time. And then optional reading is, not everybody may need this, but I get a lot of like blogs and professional newsletters and articles that people have sent me and the holiday letter from my uncle in California that are not critical to my work in any way. They would be interesting to look at. I'd like to look at them. I get those. If I can't look at it right at the time, I move it into my optional reading folder. And then I can go in there and look at stuff, when I'm bored or want to take a break. And you might say, well, that'd get pretty big. And I would say, it doesn't matter because it's optional. You only put things in that you really don't have to look at. Another kind of specialty folder like this would be if some of you subscribe to a lot of table of contents emails. Is anybody here? You could even create a rule for those that will move them right into a table of contents folder. And then you can, again, go in there when you want to be looking at table of contents. But don't glom up your inbox by having those things just sitting there. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any experience with that? Yeah.
I have a question. So I keep an inbox that is, am I not that one?
Yeah, I can tell this is going to be a good one.
So I keep an inbox that has patient-related things that I'm worried will be relevant in the next week or two, but ultimately will never be relevant again after that. And I never go back into the folder because I don't feel like taking the time to delete old ones. Do you know if you can specify by folder, I'm okay with anything in this folder being automatically deleted after a certain age? Because there's a lot of folders that I would keep forever. I would be able to search that thing 10 years
Oh, you
from
mean
now.
does Microsoft,
Yes.
does Outlook have a feature that
Yes.
allows you to select it?
Yes.
Does anybody, I don't know the answer to that.
Instead of because some of my folders are just never-endingly growing, and I have no intention to ever go and clean them up.
Could you, does anybody know, I don't know that feature
Or do you have
exists.
advice on what to do in that?
Well, yeah, I do have, of course, I always have advice. Now, whether this is good advice or not, I don't know. So I would set a time frame. Like I'm gonna, what time frame would be realistic for the patient stuff? 3 months, 6 months? And just, periodically go back that far. You can just put them chronologically and then just delete everything that's earlier. Just do it manually. Yeah. And just, you know how to do it, where you select the top one, press down the shift key, press the bottom one, delete, they all go away. Okay, press one.
Huge backlog. Just put the ones that are still relevant right now into a separate folder. Delete every.
Oh, you
just
can do
delete
that
the
too.
other folder, and then you have a new one that you can then
Yeah.
process like that.
So if you don't want to do shift, select shift.
I just don't look at them ever again.
Yeah, you can just move the relevant ones into a folder. Yeah, so I think that either of those, your technique actually might feel more comfortable to people, that they don't pick the wrong date or something. Mine is more efficient, but I'm just kidding. Those are both ideas. So does that make sense? Yeah.
Biggest joys in the world is to delete emails.
Yes.
And one of the best things that happens around here is I'll start getting messages that says, I'm running out of space.
Yes.
And that's when I go, oh, good, that means I can go in and delete emails. And
Yeah.
so then I'll just go in and delete like crazy because it helps me to it forces me to consider what all I've stored or
Right.
saved. Do I really need that?
Yeah.
And you know, usually 95% of it I don't really need a month later. It can all be deleted.
I appreciate what you get out of it and the fact that you have to do it to keep your email functioning. Where are those sitting in your inbox?
They're usually in different folders for different projects, for example.
Wow. Okay, so that
and-
must take a little while.
Sometimes. I mean, I don't do it very often.
Have you
I mean,
ever gone to searching just on there's an automatic search for just things with attachments? You might think about,
I can do that.
because
I
then
don't-
you
I
can
don't
just
do that.
massively get rid of the huge, but if it works for you to do it that way.
It works for me because usually it's by time. I just
Yeah.
kind of say, well, I don't need this. It's been,
Right.
It's, you know, that was 3 months ago, just everything from 3 months ago I
Yeah,
delete.
and I think this makes this actually leads to a really good point, so thank you for bringing that up, is that there are some things that, so people have, if you did a visual analog scale about readiness to, eagerness to delete, there would be, I never delete anything. I mean, I've had people tell me they never delete it. They have a off inbox place to put things. And other people, I know one guy, these are the two anchors. That person, I've only met one like that. And the other one is a guy at my place who told me, I think it's true, he deletes every single email that he gets. He replies and deletes. He doesn't keep anything. He said if it's important, somebody else will have it. Now, I think that, so I'm saying that there are these two ends of the spectrum. Delete a lot and right away and never delete. Everybody is somewhere along that continuum. I'm more on the delete, but not to that extreme. I'm more quick delete, and you're more of a later delete. And I think that those are both reasonable positions because the willingness to delete depends on your confidence and your decision making. And some people are, you know, are quick decision makers about that, and other people aren't. And neither is a wrong decision. I probably delete things that eventually I wish I'd kept. And you probably never do that. So you just have to figure out how much time it will take you to defer it versus doing it right away, and your comfort level with deleting. So does that make sense? So you just have to figure out where you fit on all of that. But don't let them sit in your inbox. I guess that would be my main thing. Yeah.
So what do you do with the last one, add it to your work list calendar? Because I have that, but then I leave those emails in my inbox and they start to pile up.
No, say that again. I missed the first
Okay,
part.
so the last thing on there, the outcome is new work to be done. Add it
Oh!
to your work list. I added it to my work list, but I don't want to delete
Oh,
the emails.
okay, so hang on, I didn't get to finish my slide, did I? So now let's talk about the real work of email, which is these last two categories. So there are two kinds of emails that you get during the day. The majority of them represent emails that you're expected to reply to. The person sending you the message wants you to tell them something. A decision, information, answer a question. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there's something that you're being asked to do, and the way you know that you finished that work is that you replied to the other person and gave them what they wanted. Maybe not the answer they wanted, but you gave them an answer. Okay, so that's what most emails are about. But there's another big chunk of emails, and everybody's going to have a different level of these, that represent new work being given to you. You need to fill out your evaluations for the students for the last 3 months. It's time. The person doesn't really care to have you reply to them. That's irrelevant. What they want you to do is the work, right? Or some new big project comes your way with a big outline of it and the resources and materials about it, and they say, here's your new project. Go to it. It's up to you to lead this. So for the ones where there's a reply, we've already talked about what to do. Reply right away whenever possible, and then defer if you can. And we'll look at some places in a minute. There are some messages that you get, by the way, that you should not reply to in email. So what kind would those be, do you think? Do you have any ideas? Much trouble is caused by these emails that you shouldn't be sending. Yeah, anytime there's any sense of hostility or rudeness or anger, it's generally not a good idea to respond by email, even though it's so tempting. It's so tempting to not have to face that person. Because so the reason why you shouldn't try to respond in email is because no matter what you write, no matter how pleasant or upbeat that message is that you send, it will always be interpreted negatively by the person receiving it. If they're mad at you, your nice email will make not one bit of difference. They'll find something to complain about it and just get madder. And I know this from, the proverbial 20 years of seeing emails that people have sent that have riled up, the entire department or two people. I once had to interrupt an exchange of emails between a department chair and a faculty member. They started in the morning and they were both copying me on the messages, and I had to call them both and say, stop, no more emails, let's figure this out another way. So that's one situation. What you would do is you would write and say, it sounds like we should talk. Or it sounds like I should go to HR and report you. I mean, whichever. Just go, you don't need to reply. Now, so that's, I just put that in there because there's a lot of trouble in academics caused by these kinds of messages, so I just don't want you to participate in that. Now, when it's new work to be done, of course, this is where you might have an opportunity to delegate. That would be great. But if you don't, then you're going to have to do it. And so some of these are small tasks that you could do immediately, or you have enough time right now to do the evaluations. It'll only take you 20 minutes. You have 20 minutes. Let's just get it out of the way. Straightforward. Now, if it's new work that you can't do right now, you have to get it out. You cannot manage that very effectively in your inbox. But you could manage it, if you think about it. This is typically will represent either a big task or bordering on or an actual project where there's a bunch of stuff to be done. You could make a folder in your inbox labeled projects. And I think, I hate to go back. Okay, so here's an example of a folder in your email system. It would be at the same level as your inbox. Do you know what I mean by that? Okay, projects, you can call it whatever you want. Things I'm currently working on, projects, active work, new work that came by email, whatever you want to think about it. And then you just decide what you're going to call it, and then you make a folder for it. Then that email goes in there, and that task or project goes onto your project system. You just write in new project, here's what it is. And then the material, the subsequent emails about that project go there. So you save it in a place where you know you'll be able to find it because it's a project you're currently working on. Does this make sense? So that's the way I would handle it. I would get it out of the email inbox and into a folder and then my list system. One of the reasons you want to do that is because sometimes work that comes by email is mistakenly interpreted as being urgent, like other emails feel. And a lot of that work is not urgent. And so what you need to do is think about all this other work you have over here. And you shouldn't preferentially pick the email conveyed work when you have other things that might be more important or urgent here. So you want to get it over into that system so that you can prioritize it properly and do it when the time is right, not just because it came by email. Does that make sense? It takes a little while to figure out how you're going to do this, but this project approach, or even if it was just a big task, like you had 6 months of resident evaluations, you're doing a lot of them, but it's really just one thing. Just make a folder for it, and then put it on your list. Or you could also, if it's something you could do in one sitting, you could drag it onto your calendar and create a time block. And so the email will be there with the directions right in the calendar. And you can get it out of your inbox that way. Anything else? So this, okay. Now we'll have some subliminal reinforcement. Okay, where are we going to keep our deferred messages? Well, before we get to that exciting moment, the first thing is I want to have you change your practice a little bit about emails that you defer. So in the way I did it in the old days is that I would see a message, I'd open it, and I'd go, oh, that's going to take a while, and then I'd close it. And then I might open it up a few days later and close it, and this could go on for weeks sometimes. I never really read it. I never really figured out what I was supposed to be doing. I just knew it was going to be painful. So they would just sit there, like, lumps. And so I want you to, before you close an email, before you make an email referred, an email task referred, I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. Why is it that I can't do it now? What's preventing me? Now, to do that, you're going to have to read the message so you know what it is. And that forces you to know what it is you're faced with. Because sometimes it won't be anything like what you thought just from your initial scan. So, and then, and sometimes it'll be an emotional, energetic reason. I'm tired of this conversation with John. I'm tired of John. I'm just tired. And if it's any one of those three things, then the solution is to say, oh, I realize this is an emotional energetic thing, and I can just go ahead and do it because I know what I should say. Or you can give yourself a break and come back the next day. I don't really care. Don't force yourself into some, but recognize what the problem is. It's not that you don't know how to reply. It's that you don't want to. So that'll be a small number for you, I hope. And then the next question is, if it's not that, what is it that I need to do to be able to reply to this message? Because typically, these messages are complex or there's a lot of work you have to do before you can reply. They're like little mini or sometimes not so mini projects. And so here would be a simple example. You get an email from the foundation to save the penguins in Antarctica. They want you to donate $14 million. And you're thinking about it. But there's just something about it that feels like you can't do it right now. So then you realize, well, what do I need to do? Well, first, I need to look in my account, probably your retirement account, if it's that much money. And then you realize that the password to that account is expired. So you have to change your password, look at the account, and then you'd better consult with other people in your life who might be depending on that money to see whether they agree with this. And now you have a 3-step process before you can actually reply. Now, that third one may compel you to just delete the message right away, but you know what I mean. So there's a little task list that you will find. And if you usually with me, if I just figure out the first thing, I'm good to go. Because I realize that I can't just reply or do it. I have to do something else first. So just pay attention to that now when you have emails that you think you can't do, and work toward the idea of figuring out how you're going to do them. Any questions about that? All right. So what are the places? So there are lots of different things you can do with. So there are lots of different built-in solutions for where you can put deferred emails. And just like with making a list, the key is not picking the solution, it's looking at it every day. You have to look at the deferred emails every day so that you don't ignore them. Otherwise, you end up in a situation that I've encountered many times where someone will be looking at their email, and I'll say, oh, I see you use flags. What do you use flags for? These are urgent things that I need to attend to. So then I just click on the flag icon, and we sort by flag, and we find out there's 800 of them. And I say, your definition of urgent must be different than mine. They forget to look at them. They don't realize that they can sort them out. They're not in the habit of looking at them all. So here are the options that I know about. Now, okay, one would be to make a folder, inbox emails that require action, or something like that. For me, this would be like the dead letter office. It would be really hard for me to train myself to look in that folder every day. But I know people that do it effectively. So it's not that you can't do it that way. You just need to be sure that you will train yourself to look every single day, okay? So that's one option. That's the super simple. Make a folder, put things in it. Look every day. Okay, so that's easy. A second option, which many of you are probably not ready to take yet, but might want to know about in case you want to use it, and some of you already have a system like this. There are to-do list apps, including, I don't think that Microsoft's To-Do can do this yet. They can't, can they? And I don't think Reminder, does anybody know with Reminder? Can you send an email to Reminder? Does anybody know? There are other programs where you can do that, where you can just forward the email to the app, and it'll be treated like a list item. You can do that. You use it in the Outlook task program. You can do that. The native task that they're going to be getting rid of, you can easily do that. So if you have an app that allows you to forward emails, then you can use that method. And then again, you just have to look there every day, and it'll be incorporated in all of your tasks. You can prioritize and so forth. Now, the other method involves keeping those messages in your inbox. Now, I have decided that this does not violate the inbox zero method, because you're putting them in a separate. If you imagine having a big space here, and you've got a big bucket basket that's this tall and a little basket. The one you want to have empty at the end of the day is the big basket where all the new stuff came. The little basket is where you put the things that you're going to come back to. And so if you can create a little basket essentially in your inbox, it's okay to do that. Again, as long as you look at it every day. So the options you have for that are using a flag, which you can do in, how many people use, how many Mac Outlook users, Windows Outlook users? This will work, I think, in both of them. You know, they change so often and they're not in parallel programs, so in the Outlook, newest version of the Outlook Windows, if you have an inbox, an email in the inbox, and you click the flag lights up and the message turns yellow. It's highlighted. Very cool, and makes this a much more usable method in my method. I don't know if the Mac version does that. Somebody will have to try it. It does. So using that flag with a highlight, and then keeping your inbox permanently sorted by flag. So the flag stuff is always at the top. That way you never forget about it, and you'll have like 2 groups. It'll sort into this group and this group. And where you need to get through are the ones that aren't flagged. So that's probably these days the simplest way to do this. The other option that you have is in Outlook is to create a category. It's the other way to designate an email. It's like a tag, a label in Gmail. How many people know about labels in Gmail? Oh, it's just a tagging system. They call them labels. So with the category designation, you create a category. You can make it whatever color you want. You can have multiple categories, so you could keep project-related to-dos in one spot and other tasks in another spot. You just assign the category to the message and then sort the email by category. So it's a lot like flags, except you could have more than one that would be labeled clearly with what was in there. I kind of think if you're going to try this, the flag method would be the one I'd recommend. And if you're interested in the other one, email me, and I'll give you more information about the categorizing method. The thing you don't want to do is to make too many. If you use categories, people want to go wild and have like 18 categories for things that need to be done. It's a disaster. You're much better off starting with one group to begin, one basket to begin with, and then only expand if you need to do something else. So the idea here is you're going to clear out all the unread ones in that big batch that have come in today or whenever, and you're going to have that little group of clearly identified messages that sit together or can be made to sit together that represent ones that you're going to work on later. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about project work. Any other email questions? Yes? Vacations. Let's take one right now.
Yes, I agree. How do you manage after being gone for a week or two and you come back to 1,200 emails?
You know, the vacation thing is a tough one because a lot of people do this different ways. The ideal method, which is hard to get yourself to do psychologically, is to schedule an extra day of vacation. Come back from your vacation a day early and spend that day catching up, doing email, getting prepared for what's to come. That's one way to do it. And that doesn't pull away from your work because you're doing it on that one day. You can put some blocks of time in the week after you get back that are there for you to go back through the old email and get caught up in little chunks instead of that extra day of vacation. What you can't say is, I'm just going to forget all this, right? So you've got to think out something. Now, I have a colleague who spent a lot of time abroad working, and he had a message that said, while I am in China for the next 6 months, I will not be responding to any emails. So if you really need to contact me, you should wait and do it after I'm back. Now, most of you are not in a position to be able to do that. He was sort of he wasn't independently wealthy, but he was independent scholarly wealthy. He could kind of do whatever he wanted. So you can tell people that you're not going to be responding. This is an approach that people use. I'm not going to be responding during this week, so if you need me, you'll need to write me back after I get back. It's a little, that might not be appreciated by everyone, so you have to think about who writes to you. If you, with the EMR, you can have somebody else monitor, but I don't know how most of you would find someone else to clear out your email for you. to get rid of all the junk. I just think that probably was, so I think when you get back to facilitate the speeding up, you should organize by sender and then delete big chunks with using the shift click method. And you can get rid of vast amounts of deletable items right away to speed up that process. Another one that you should use, and I actually usually do this, I actually keep up when I'm on vacation. Now, the downside of that is I probably don't ever completely get away from work. But I'll be honest, because I limit myself to first thing in the morning before anybody else is up, and then I never look at it again until the next morning. For me, I can actually separate myself. I remember when I was in the provost's office, I had a new provost, I was getting ready to go on a vacation for 2 weeks to Hawaii, and I thought, well, this would be great, I'm not going to do any email. And his secretary came in and said, of course, Provost Blue, that's kind of how I thought of him after this, says you need to be available every day on vacation. So that dinged that. But for me, that's worked really well. I'm not recommending that to any of you. I'm just telling you that depending on your job and how long you're going to be gone, you might decide that that's a better approach than getting hit, when you get back. I'd prefer that you did some kind of scheduling time off when you got back. That would be a better way to do it. Anybody have any other approach that they use? When I'm on a business trip, I always keep up.
Yeah,
I don't.
The out of office function I find to be really helpful because you'll see your email volume dwindle down over time because people realize you're not going to be responding because after all they send an email for a response.
Oh, you should always use out of office. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just that seemed yeah. So you should always set an out of office message and then yeah. But it doesn't prevent people from writing to you the first time. So you've got to do some mix. Any other solutions? Okay. I don't like to do my email on my vacation, but I've just learned that for me, then when I come back, I'm just ready to start right in. And it does not interrupt my vacation. So I think that's, for me, that works. For other people, it wouldn't. Okay, now we're going to talk about a little bit about finding time to do that project work. We've talked about those big things. So here, again, is another example of my graphic artist prowess. This is a little graph of me sort of describing how I and some other people approach big work, especially if it has a deadline, where we maybe do a little bit, and then we do nothing for a long time, and then we have a day that's open, and we think, oh, good, now I can work on this project. I've got some uninterrupted free time, and then we never have that again, or we stop, and then when the deadline comes, we're all in for a few days or a couple weeks. Does this look familiar? Do you know anybody that? So. What are the reasons that people do this? Why do people work this way?
We learn it in school.
Yeah, well, I think it is true that a lot of people started doing that when they were like in middle school, junior high, because they knew that they always could get it done and got A's, and so why change? So there's just a habit, and you get that kind of adrenaline rush at the end that I've accomplished something. So some of it is just habitual. You've always done it that way. What other things might lead you to practice? Yeah.
The highest priority is at the time. The thing that becomes the highest priority is the next thing.
Yeah. So remember we said at the beginning, everybody has multiple priorities. And so you have different deadlines or different expectations, different urgencies of things that you're working on, plus all that routine work that's otherwise piling up and burying you. So you have a lot of things to do in here. I actually think, except for those of us who really are procrastinators, we have an executive functioning disorder, and it's hard for us to stay on track. I was so excited when I learned that, by the way. It's not a moral character flaw. There really is something in your brain if you're an extreme procrastinator, which can be overcome. So a lot of stuff is going on. Now, there's one other big reason that people do this is that they say they get their best ideas and do their best work if they wait and do it under pressure. Have you ever heard of that? Yeah. I don't know, now this is just a thought experiment on my part, but I got to thinking I don't actually get my best ideas under pressure. When I'm under pressure, it's only if there's a deadline that I might get good ideas. But other times when feel like I'm pressured to do something, I don't actually do my best work. So I thought, well, what could be going on here, for me at least? And it turns out that there are two things going on simultaneously during this time frame. You're under pressure to meet the deadline, and you're also intensively engaged with the material. And it turns out that does produce good ideas when you're intensively engaged with the material. And so it's probably, and so it may not be the pressure at all. It may be the fact that the pressure has forced you to become intensively engaged, and that's why you get good ideas. Now, the problem is that although most of the time what you do in this phase is good enough, if you don't always have time to fully use those good ideas that you had. You don't have time to develop them, to integrate them into your product, and so forth. So you could do potentially better work if you got those ideas in an earlier phase. Got new ideas along here that you could work on, and then you'd still have a rush at the end, but it wouldn't be the same kind of rush. You'd be starting with rich material that's partially developed instead of sort of from scratch. So the argument here would be that it might be better to have a process for working on projects, and then with projects that are a team project, there are all kinds of troubles when you do this because you throw other people off, right? There are other people have deadlines for you, and that's a real mess. Now, there's one other reason for writers, and that is when you have a writing project that does not have a deadline. This, for those, how many people here are faculty members? So, we get caught up in writing grants for deadlines because you have to do that, right, if you do work that requires grants. So I completely get that. But what is the thing that really has the most impact on your career, on the science, on patients? What's the thing that actually makes a difference? It's not grants. It's the papers you write. Right? It's the papers that are the real thing you want to do. And so I have to tell you, I've read about this, so I know it's true everywhere, and I've experienced this just in looking at people's careers through my faculty affairs work. Lots of people have many papers sitting in their desk drawer. They're partially done, and they never get them written. And it's a major cause of academic failure, not getting those papers done. And because there is no deadline, a lot of people don't have a method to work on them that doesn't involve a real external deadline. So I didn't mean that to sound so depressing, because there's a bright side to the solution. Okay, so I love this quote. It's from a book by a writer who was writing a little handbook of sort of how to write for professional writers, not for us, but for people that write novels and that sort of thing. And this just jumped out at me. Work, not contemplating work, is what brings satisfaction. What a lot of us do, including me, is we spend a lot of time contemplating our work. We make lists, we think about our work, but we're not actually doing anything to move forward. And we have to shift to doing some thinking about it, but then shifting over to work much more quickly. So I'm going to talk about a process that, so the basic point, the big point about this would be for your highest priority project or two to try to work on them in some fashion almost every day. Not to wait till you have a big bunch of uninterrupted time or feel motivated, neither of which is necessary in order to do the work. Sometimes there might be just a small task you need to do, even for a paper, or there might be some writing you need to do, and you want to try to figure out something every day that you can do that will move that project forward. So that's the basic idea, but easier said than done, as I'm sure you know. So let's talk about how you could find this time. So one of the most common pieces of advice that you'll get about this is to try to do something first thing in the morning. Basically, the idea is before you get involved in your regular work with phone calls coming in and interruptions and new things that pop up and your routine work and so forth. And so, and if you can do this, this is a great way to do it. But not everybody can, either because they don't really do well in the morning, although they may not have tried it, so if they aren't sure, you should try it. But sometimes life gets in the way on this one, and there just isn't any way that you can devote even 30 minutes to working on a project, whether it's writing or something else, in the morning before you go to work. It's just not realistic. If you can't do it then, my advice would be to try to do something as early in the day as possible, because of the thing I mentioned about the longer you wait, the more likely you are to get kind of overwhelmed with what's going on that day. But the other reason is if you do something, even a tiny little thing at the beginning of the day, as early as possible in the day, you feel successful. Here's this thing you've been putting off and not working on, and now you did something concrete about it. And it really changes your approach to the whole day. And if you can do that regularly, you can see how that would build on itself to encourage you to reinforce the habit of trying to do something as early in the day as possible. So that's one idea. The other idea is to schedule time blocks. Maybe this is all the rage right now. There are books written about time blocks and probably 1,000 blogs, and it's everywhere. They're everywhere. They're not a new thing, of course. People have been using time blocks for decades. Students use them all the time, college students. They say, I'm going to study biology from 1 to 2 because my lab is at 3 and I'd better be ready for it. So, and they put it on their calendar. And then when they graduate, they stop doing it. And why do you think they stop doing it? Why do people tend to stop using time blocks when they get out of either undergraduate or graduate school? It's a pretty simple reason, actually. It's because they have less control of their time all of a sudden. When you're an undergraduate, you just remember those days fondly when you really could decide to study biology from 1 to 2 o'clock on Tuesday. And now, if you tried to do that, that might not always work out so well, right, because of the way your job is configured. So it's the figuring out how to do it that's the problem. So, so the sort of science behind time blocks comes from work done on what are called implementation intentions, which, as I understand it, is the study of how people, what conditions increase the likelihood that someone will do the thing they say they're going to do. So implementation intentions. And the idea here would be if you had these two groups of people, this group says, I'm going to work on my project, whatever it is, for 3 hours this week. And this group says, I'm going to work on my project for 3 hours at 1 o'clock from 1 to 2 on Monday, from 1 to 2 on Wednesday, from 1 to 2 on Friday in the library of my department with a candlestick, and the butler will come. And, you know, kind of a kind of a clue kind of deal. So basically with implementation instructions, the more you define about when and what you're going to do, the more likely you are to do it. It's like 3 times as much, 3 times as much. So that doesn't necessarily make them easier to do if you don't have a lot of control over your time. So we'll move on here, but I just want you to understand that this is a method that has some has validity to doing it, to it. One of the things that's helpful to think about is, and it's sometimes a barrier for people, it's not the time, but it's that they come up against the block and they say, ooh, I have other things to do, and then move on. I have something more important to do, so I'm just going to skip this block. So it helps to understand kind of the microanatomy, if you will, of a time block. So here are the phases, at least as I think about them. The first one is that when you create a time block, you need to have an idea about what you're going to do during that time block. Don't just put down project A or write or grant. Don't do that. That's overwhelming, undifferentiated. When you sit down, you'll have to think about what you're going to do. And that'll take up all the time, and you'll be discouraged, and you'll never do it again. Instead, you want to say, on this block, I'm going to work on the methods, and I'll start by looking at the second paragraph where I left off last time, so that you have a specific goal for what you're going to work on during the time. And then you need to stay focused and not let yourself be interrupted or distracted. And then when you're finished, and now you can establish the cycle here where at the end of the block, you'll say, what's the next thing I need to do to work on this project, whatever it is. And that becomes your starting point for the following block. So you can put it into a list if you want to, or if you have blocks scheduled, you can stick it into that block. So you always have something to do. You can change your mind when the time comes, but you're never left with a blank screen, basically. Yeah?
So I've done this before, especially for the never-ending, no deadline paper.
Right.
But there's always been a more pressing issue that has come up from us or somebody else that requires more urgency that then runs over.
Yeah, so when you, especially when you have things coming from your boss that have to be done right away, it's a challenge, isn't it? But it doesn't necessarily mean it's impossible. You just have to get more clever about it. One of the things, if your boss is constantly bringing you things that to you don't actually seem that urgent, he or she is just always in a hurry to get things done, and you have some big important project that you need to work on that's for the good of the group, it's not just your own personal thing, you could go to your boss someday and say, you know, I'm trying to work on this big important project that we've agreed is something that's going to be valuable to the institution or to my career, whatever. And so I'd like to start, don't say, and stop writing, calling me with these new things. And I'd like to start with an experiment where I set aside 45 minutes every day to work on this project. And I put it on my calendar if you want. And if it's obviously really urgent to interrupt me during that 45 minutes, then do it. But I'd like to try this and see if I don't become more productive on behalf of you. I mean, that's kind of the pitch, right? There's no way that you can completely get around that, and not all bosses will respond to that. They'll just say, do it anyway. I say so. I completely get that that's a problem. So that's the basic, and this, you can apply this structure to a time block of any length. A minimum time block would probably be about 30 minutes to work on a project. And then it could be anything but. So think about 30 minutes as your minimum time during which you will be able to get something done if you use this method of working on the project almost every day and defining these next steps. That's the key. Okay, time block scheduling. This is sort of obvious, but some people wonder, well, when should I do it? So if you are in a position to be able to do it at the same time every day, I don't care what time, that's the best from a habit-forming position. Now, I know that I have a couple of clients right now at home who are chemistry professors, and they use time blocking almost exclusively to plan their time. And they can do it because they can say, I'm going to meet with my students here and not here. And I think, wow, this is so cool. And I said to one of them, now the physicians that I work with, and lab scientists for that matter, these people don't work in a lab, I said, really have a hard time using time blocks. And he looked at me and he said, do they really can't do them, or do they just not want to do them? And I thought, James, they can't do them because they're going to the ER and so on and so forth. So it's not true that everybody can use a scheduled time block. So don't panic. Every time would be good. Some people can only get a day a week when they, in theory, are on admin or scholarship time. If you have that day, do not fill it up with patient care stuff and email. First thing in the morning, set aside an hour to work on your project with a little buffer time after so that you can keep going if you need to. 1 hour, just 1 hour at the beginning of the day, and then move into that other stuff as you need to. But don't waste it on things that aren't, that you can compress or collapse however you like. Yeah.
Do you have advice as to how to tell people to stay out of that time?
Well, if it's on your calendar, that'll help. So put down meeting with the dean. You can use meeting with or Dr. MS, myself would be myself. You could put a sign on your door, close your door, put a sign on it. I'm in the middle of something. I'll be done at this time. I'd appreciate, unless it's urgent, that you leave me alone. Don't say it quite like that. So you can do that. You could go someplace else. Those are kind of the big things: calendar, sign on the door, go someplace else. Yeah. Ideally, every division head would understand this phenomena and realize that for people to actually get focused work done, they have to be able to set aside focused time, and will allow everybody to do at least an hour a day. That would be the ideal thing on a day when you're not in clinic all day. And understand that that's how people are going to progress, and that person's own reputation will be enhanced by the productivity of the division or department. But unfortunately, not everybody sort of gets it. And they do what they can to disrupt you, and you have to figure out a way around it. You could do also ad hoc scheduling. You just look at your schedule at the beginning of the week, find a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, and then plunk in an appointment during that time. Now, you can also use the Neil Fiore unschedule method, which is you make an intention to write, and you make a little list of like 3 things you in a row that you could write about. And then when a moment appears, you just sit down and work on the project. You just work on it as long as you can. It's just ad hoc, and then you get to record it on your calendar as time that you actually did. So this is a form of self-monitoring that helps with habit formation and encourage you to keep going, just like keeping track of steps or writing down what you eat every day. So you could use this method, and that allows you to take care of the odd moments that pop up. And for something substantive, you really only need 30 minutes to get something done. And if it's a task, you could do it a lot quicker. So if you know at the beginning of the day what you're aiming for, you'll be able to take advantage of that time. Does that make sense to you? So I am not going to say that this is easy, even for people that have pretty much control over their time, to our eyes. But you sort of have to make a decision. Either I'm going to do this work or I'm going to do something different. But you can't go through your whole career saying, I just don't have any time to do it, but yet I know that I'm expected to do it. And do you know what I mean? That's just, that's what really makes you crazy. That's what really makes you crazy. So I think you can do it. Now, the distraction part, you have to, I don't know what you're distracted by. Everybody has a different sort of distraction profile from other people in themselves. This is Hugo Gernsback, who was a physical scientist and well known for being the editor of the first journal in this discipline in the early 1900s. He was also known for being a really odd guy. So he was obsessed with distractions and developed this thing called the isolator, which was like a diving helmet that was airtight, had to be hooked up to oxygen. There were no ear holes to cut down on audible. And the eye holes were slits were just wide enough to let him look at one line of type at a time. This did not catch on. You cannot go to eBay and get an isolator. But his idea was a good one. So you have to figure out what, if you think you have a lot of trouble with interruptions and distractions, keep a log for a while of when you're doing focus work, what's interrupting you. And so you can see, do I really need to move to a different location because this is just, there's nothing to do about it? Or are there people you can talk to about, this is what I'm doing, so when I put this sign up, don't come. There are different ways that, that you can deal with that. You can't eliminate all distractions, but you can reduce them. The Pomodoro is probably the technique that's most commonly used for, is a very commonly used technique to help get started with project work and to focus on it through a period of time. In this case, the minimal amount is 25 minutes in the original Pomodoro method. How many people here know the Pomodoro technique? Good. So does anybody here use it? So here's how, this was invented by Francesco Cirillo when he was a graduate student, and he was having trouble focusing. So he came up with this method. It involved a kitchen timer that looked like that, which is a tomato. Can you see it looks like a tomato? And he called the technique Pomodoro because Pomodoro is the Italian word for tomato. So even if you don't like this technique, now when you go to an Italian restaurant and you see pasta with Pomodoro sauce, you'll know what you're getting. So there's value in that. So the method involves the following. You take a piece of paper and write at the top what it is you're going to work on for the next 25 minutes, just a little statement of a goal, just like we talked about. And then you set your timer for 25 minutes. And while you're doing that, you say to yourself, during the next 25 minutes, I'm only going to work on the thing I wrote down on this piece of paper, and I'm not going to let myself be interrupted. Can you remember that? You have to say those exact words in order to. No, you're just setting an intention when you set the timer to do that. And then tick, 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 you work for 25 minutes, and then the timer goes off, bing, and then you can take a break if you want to. Cirillo was into these 5-minute breaks. I don't think most people do that. I think if they're working along and want to do more, they just keep going and then stop when they're done. Probably at 90 minutes, you should stop for a few minutes just to kind of shake it off, because your brain works intensively better in, for most people, 90-minute cycles. So there's that. And then the final part is how to manage interruptions. So here we are, we're working away in our office, and the dean walks in and says, I would like to speak to you. Do you know what the dean looks like? Okay, good, because you wouldn't respond correctly if you didn't. And he says, I would like to speak to you right now. And you pick up your tomato timer and say, I can speak to you in 11 minutes. Could you come back then? That's all you do. See how easy that is? No, no, no. What you do is when someone else interrupts you or when you are distracted by thinking of something that you might want to do, you ask yourself one question: can this wait till the timer goes off? Whether there's 24 minutes left or 1 minute left, your whole goal is to get through 25 minutes. And so if it's another person and it's appropriate, which it would not be in this case that I presented, you would negotiate with the person when you're getting back to them, and you would write it down on the piece of paper, get back to John in an hour, or when I'm done with this. If it's something that you've thought of, like, oh, I have to call the dentist to get my teeth cleaned. Dentists do not work, except when you're working. Their offices aren't open, so you're going to have to do it during work. And so, are there any dentists here? No? Okay, good. So you don't call the dentist, it would just take a minute. No, you write it down on the piece of paper, call the dentist. And then as soon as the timer's done, you're free to do what you want. You can do those things, you can move on to another Pomodoro and wait till later. But what you do is you get them out of your head so they're not distracting you from your work. That's the Pomodoro technique. It's used by a lot of people for writing, but it can also be used for any other kind of work. Some people use it to limit how much time they're spending on email. You do 1 Pomodoro of email. You don't have to buy a timer like that. If you go to your phone, you'll find all kinds of apps for your phone. There are web browser versions. There are some programs that for writing that have that Pomodoro timer built into them. So you have lots of different options. You could use just a regular timer, but let me caution you, you have to have a sound at the end. You can't just look up at the clock and say, oh, it's 1:45, I'm going to go till, because then you have to stop and figure out when 25 minutes really is. Oh yeah, don't do that. So have a timer you can set and have it go off at the end. Those are the 2 key pieces. Okay, now we're going to finish up by talking about some tactical planning. We're not going to talk about a 12-week cycle plan. I don't know why that's up there. I deeply apologize. If you want to know about 12-week cycle planning, email me and I'll send you some materials. I did not intend to include that today. We're going to talk about weekly and daily plans, way more fun and useful to get started with. So the weekly plan is, how many people here sit down and plan out their week in some way? So a lot of you will have a great opportunity to improve your productivity right off the bat, because this is something that's super simple to do, and you can start doing it this weekend, or Friday. People do it different days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning, whatever works. The idea is that if you don't plan what you'd like to get done this week, most of it will never happen. So you know what important things you want to get done. You're going to look to see in your schedule where you might fit them in and make a plan for that, and decide what it is you want to get done so you aren't overly ambitious or underly ambitious, as well as looking at all the routine things to be sure you know what's coming up in your week. So that's the idea behind weekly planning. So there are 2 features here. The first one is the one I'd recommend you start with. Well, no, you can start with either one. Forgetting about that 12-week plan stuff. What is that doing in there? I just don't know. Okay, so the first thing would be to review what I call my inventory of work. So this is all the work that I've committed to that's on that master list that I was talking about, that I've committed to, not the someday list, the committed to. And I look through every item, and I say, should this still be here? Have I already done it? Is it too late? Do I not want to, is it really not appropriate to do it anymore? If there's an item that's too vague and I don't really know what it is, I try to remember, and then I rewrite the item so that it reflects something that I could actually do. And I just go through my list and update it, basically, so that it's complete and I've reviewed it. And just by reviewing it, even if you didn't do anything else, you'd make better decisions in the coming week because you would have looked at that stuff. You also want to look at your calendar. I usually go ahead at least 3 weeks where I look at every single thing on my calendar, and I'm asking myself 2 questions. Is this something I need to prepare for in advance? And then I make a note either on the calendar the day before, or I put it on my weekly list of tasks I really want to get done, however you want to keep track of that. And then I look for logistical problems, like, oh, I'm scheduled in 2 meetings back-to-back in buildings that are 2 miles apart on campus. That won't work very well. I made a mistake, so I have to renegotiate, or somebody needs to take the kids to their ballet lessons, and oh, I'm not going to be able to do it because I have this meeting, and it gives you time to find somebody. One time I found plane tickets I didn't have for a meeting that week, and this was in the paper ticket days, so it was not just a matter of going online and getting them. That was horrible, but I found them in time. So look at your to-do list and your calendar and just see what it is that's coming up. And then the second thing you can do is to look for 1 or 2 key results you'd like to achieve for your highest priority projects by the end of the week. And so the way that would look is you would focus on a completion goal, not a work on goal. So what we'll often say is, I'm going to work on my K award this week, or I'm going to work on the paper this week, or I'm going to work on the birthday party. But we don't say what it is we're going to do. And our brain has no idea what we're talking about when we say work on. So instead you want to say, I aim to complete the following by the end of the week. And that jumpstarts your brain to start to figure out how are we going to fit that into the day. So when you make your daily plans and have free bits of time that pop up, you're more likely to work on those things. You can do time blocks if you want to, or not. Now, the final thing that you can do on a weekly basis, I mean, there are many things you could do, but this would be another thing, would be to set some time, plan kind of how you're going to spend your time that week across your whole life, not just at work. Set some boundaries about when you're going to work. So the red squares there are times that this person has decided they will probably need to do work, professional work. Some of it's at night, some of it's on a weekend. That's okay, as long as it's clearly bounded and you're not trying to fit it in while you're doing other personal things. You let your family know I have to work here and here, but the rest of the time I'm not working. So you're setting boundaries. And then you plan some fun stuff to do, social stuff, things with your family, to the extent that you want to, so that those things happen instead of just slipping away when you don't plan anything. And then if you want to do your time blocks, you could add those in. So you have kind of a big picture of personal time, work time, and when the important work is likely to get done. So this is optional, but sometimes it can be really helpful in looking at what the week is going to bring. Okay, and we'll finish up with the day. You could start, if you wanted to, just with this, because this is super easy, but it helps to do the weekly to make this more effective, I'll just say. So a daily MIT plan is what some people, what people who write about this think of as a short list of tasks that are related to high priority work, not all the things you're going to do that day. You might have a separate list of things you want to try to get done, but they're not these super important things. So you want the list to be short and focused, limited to high priority things so that you're more likely to get them done. Here's what happens if you make a big long list, like you just dump everything out in the morning of all the things you can think of that you should do today. It'll be a mix of unimportant and important things. And I don't know about you, but during the day, if I looked at that list and one thing was work on the abstract that's due next week and refill my stapler, I would always pick the stapler. Quick win, cross off, oxytocin or whatever gets released. So by forcing the list down to a really small one, if you had a list of, like, as I do, only no more than 3 things that are these high priority tasks, I would feel embarrassed to put refill the stapler on that list, and I always say, oh, I suppose I have to put the abstract on there because it's coming up and it's important. And then because it's such a tiny list, I'm usually pretty good at getting it done, getting to it. So it really has helped me focus. The must be done category in my list are things that have a deadline of today, a real honest to goodness external deadline. The bill is due, I promise to have this done by today, whatever. Not internal deadlines, or it would be really good if I did, it would be an actual deadline, so that there's some adverse outcome if you don't do it. That list often doesn't have anything on it. And most days it doesn't, because most days you don't have something that actually has to be done today outside of your normal work. So I just keep a list that usually has no more than 3 to 5 things on it for my daily most important list. Now, so your day is driven by lots of different things, right? We've just been talking about kind of high priority work here. So, but you have a calendar, and there are things on your calendar. That's the primary driver, where you have to be places. There's kind of routine work that you have to do, whatever that is. There are little tasks that show up during the day, or even big ones that interrupt your work that you have to do. And then you have this high priority task list. So you have to think about all of these things. And you know this. I mean, it looks terrible when you see it in a slide. Oh my God, I have all this stuff. But this is really sort of how your day is organized. And what you're trying to do is get this stuff done while at the same time fitting in some of those things. Now, the real problem, of course, is interruptions, which happen to you all every day. And so you also have to become facile at triaging. It's obvious I'm not going to be able to get all this done today. Which things will I work on and which things will I put off? And you'd be better off someday saying some of this routine stuff is going to get put off till tomorrow, and I'm going to do the important thing. Because when you think about your career, it's the important stuff that really counts. And you have to use your own judgment, but you have to get good at splitting that around. So Cal Newport, who is writes about these things, he's a computer scientist at Georgetown. has this really, I think, nice way of describing this. The reality of daily scale productivity, what you get done today, is that plans are not meant to be preserved. What he means by that is, when you make a plan in the morning, it doesn't mean you'll actually do that. It means, instead, the plan is meant as a device for ensuring that you tackle your day with deliberation, rather than the whims of things that pop up. So thank you very much. We are done. Now, I have two reference slides here. These are more general resources for time management and productivity. And these are specifically about writing. And I highly recommend these two books in the box if you're wanting to improve your academic writing. They're both terrific. You'll probably want to start with the Sylvia book because he's an academic psychologist. And he writes more from a kind of science point of view. Jolie is a communications professor, but her book addresses a lot of issues that Paul doesn't. So the two together, they're both pretty short and in recent editions. It's a really good resource for you if you want to do that. Now, my pledge here is that you have a lifetime pass, each of you, to email me with any questions you have about today's presentation, or if there are any other areas that you'd like more information about. I can send you links to things and a direction of where to look. And you can look at, I've got, I think, 8 or 9 articles, short columns that I wrote several years ago on my website. On the homepage, articles, go there. Topics that overlap with some of this or are different that are helpful in the academic world. So take a look at those as just a kind of a way to get yourself started thinking about some different issues you may have. All right. Some of you are staying. If everyone leaves, then I'll know I'm done for the day. But otherwise, so thank you for those of you who are leaving now. And I hope a few of you decide to stick out the next version. Thanks.